for Emory Atlanta 60 plus. We have also invited our younger friends of Emory Atlanta 40 plus, because everybody over 60 is over 40. So we're doing a lot of coordination with that group, and they've got an event on entrepreneurial today at 7, and they've got another event on October 8th that we've posted on our Facebook page that might be of interest. Before we get started, I just wanted to point out one of our Facebook posts. We've created a team for the Winship Virtual 5K. And we also sent it out in our email. So if you don't do Facebook, search for Emory or Emory 60 plus in your email. And if you see our email that came last Friday, it's the very first topic. And we'd love for you to join our team. It only requires a $35 donation to Winship. They don't actually follow up if you've walked the 5K, although so many people are walking these days. It would be great if everybody could, and they've got other virtual activities that you can do. So give that a look-see if you can. Okay, and now to the moment we've all been waiting for. I will introduce Dr. Rick Gilkey. When President Wagner came to Emory, gosh, what is it, 15 years ago now, 16? One of his first observations was that Emory needed to act like a university and not a multiversity, and that the schools and units needed to work together more and do more to support each other. Well, Rick was way ahead of that trend because he's been part of the School of Medicine and the School of Business for eons and eons. And he has brought those two units together and combining and coordinating the gifts of both. And in today's presentation, you'll get an idea of that. So he was our poster child for university. As we've mentioned in the postings, he was repeatedly the best professor at both of those schools. I mean, at Goizueta Business School, he won it every single year that I was there. They really just should have called it the Gilkey Award because nobody even came a close second. And I think after today, you'll understand why. He's going to offer us some hot off the presses, brand new research that none of you have seen, not even you, Ellen. And it's so timely. It is perhaps the most timely, focusing on our current conflict, of course, with COVID, with the election, and how can we cope with all of that. So without further ado, Dr. Rick Gilkey.
Well, thank you very much, Andrea. That's a lovely introduction, and we have nowhere to go but down from there. So perfect. And Sam, thank you for your introduction, your invitation rather, and Kevin and Brandon for your support and counsel through this. So this is definitely a team effort, and any credit due is due to the team. So what I would like to talk about today is some of the implications of some of the newer research that's being done on hemispheric differences in the brain. And it struck me that it's somewhat ironic and even tragically relevant right now in a world that is so divided. And I was reminded of that. One of our international visiting professors at Emory is a very dear friend of mine and colleague, Hervé Koiko. And I just got a note from him, which I won't read, but basically describing what's going on in France now and the divides. You know, Paris versus the rest of France, urban versus rural, wealth versus not so wealthy, you know, different levels of education. So in every way that French society can be stratified, it is not only stratified, but it's divided. And it just struck me that at the heart of all this is the kind of neural correlates that we do have a divided brain. If it's functional, it's a healthy state. If it's not functional, it creates all kinds of pathologies that may be reflected in some of the current environment where, as we saw last night, you can't really even have a coherent conversation or dialogue. So I don't want to draw or extrapolate too much on this, but I think as I describe some of the things that we're learning about the brain, you will see that there are social, cultural, and political manifestations of these anatomical discoveries that we're making, and ones that we need to take seriously and act on if we're going to build on our better natures, to use our potential as human beings, and to create a more livable world. So that's kind of the background of all this. So I think what I will do is see, I can see screen share here. So if you'll forgive a moment of, well, no, I've got it here. Let's see.
And while you're doing that, Rick, I forgot to mention that if you have a question, please submit it in the chat. And at the end of the session, I will read off the questions to Dr. Gilkey, just like we did with Dr. Sheth. And if everyone would momentarily turn on their video, I want to take a picture of all of our attendees. You can shut it off in 1 minute.
Okay, let me know when I can put my screen up then, because I don't want to mess up your photo op here.
Important, right?
And yeah, I will leave time at the end for questions. And Andrea is going to be kind of our moderator and kind of pull together, because usually you get some repetition in questions. So she's going to kind of try to pull that together, and we can have a little bit of a dialogue. That's the trickiest part of online, obviously. You can't have the free, easy flow of conversation that we're accustomed to and expect to have. So let me know when I can go ahead with the screen, Andrea.
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. All right. Now do you, okay, so here we go. And
yeah, perfect.
There we go. Okay, excellent. Thank you. So can everybody see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, that's fine. I often begin these alumni presentations, and this one is particularly appropriate, with invoking Roger Sperry, who welcomes us back, and in this case, virtually. And I'll just let you read that. And the reason that Sperry makes reference to his left and right hemisphere or brain is because he was kind of the master of that domain. He did a lot of the early split brain research and made enormous discoveries with that. He had elegant experiments. He had people who had through surgical procedures for medical reasons, a split brain, the corpus callosum was severed. And he was able to actually devise incredibly creative experiments where he could actually interview the left hemisphere and then the right hemisphere. In one of his earliest pieces of research, he interviewed a young man and asked him, what do you want to be when you finish school? And his left hemisphere said, I want to be a draftsman, and then went on logically and sequentially describing all the steps of the training that he was following. And then he asked the right hemisphere, and the right hemisphere said, I want to be a race car driver. But no plan or idea how that was going to work. And his left hemisphere was absolutely shocked at that crazy, extravagant idea. And that was the beginning of an understanding that we really have when we say we're of two minds about something, that in some ways that might be quite literally true. That research was followed up on, and Ruth Carter, who was a good clinician as well as researcher, described clinical cases of people with separate brain divisions and disconnects. And one time she was talking to a patient trying to set up an appointment, and the patient said, well, I can't come for 2 hours after work. And Carter was a good clinician and said, well, why is that? And she said, because I have to change clothes. And she said, well, tell me more. Which is interesting, because she was smart enough not to say, why is that? Because the patient had no idea why it was. But she said, what happened? She said, well, what happened is my left hand picks out things that I want to wear, and my right hand throws them away and grabs something else. And so she's literally having this alien hand syndrome, it's called. And her left hand was trying to dress correctly and conservatively, and her right hand was trying to pick out things that were more colorful and flamboyant. And that's part of the reason that she came to see Dr. Carter, is that she just couldn't get through her day because of these difficulties. So we know these are very real differences. I want to just also put a couple of provisos in here to be a little bit careful about this. One is a general one. If our brain was simple enough to understand, it would be too simple enough to understand it. So we are always, as this a line from a wonderful Howard Nemeroff poem tells, we live in the next room of the dream. We're once removed from being able to actually directly observe or even understand what goes on inside of us. We make a very poor scientific object unto ourselves. We're getting better because of technology, of course. So this is an inexact science, that's the point. And we like to talk about empirical modeling, but the reality is there's a lot of intuition, guesswork, extrapolating in all of this. Related to that is Damasio's famous dictum that anything that I'm likely to say today, if it's true, it may only be 51% true. There are a lot of exceptions. I remember as an undergraduate having a wonderful chemistry professor, and I was just asking him, well, you know, how did your education work? And he said, well, it was really fairly simple. He said, I spent the first 2 years in my doctoral studies learning the rules, and the rest of my life and career learning the exceptions and dealing with them. And the brain is kind of like that as well. The basic factor here that organizes so much of what I'll talk about is that it's designed to do one thing, this brain, and that's survive. And there's a wonderful book Matt Lieberman wrote, Lebowski wrote, called Social. And it's about the fact that to survive, we have to be social. So much of what goes on in our brains is related to enhancing our ability to make social connections and maintain memberships in social aggregates, because that's how we survive. And so you'll see a lot of reference to that as I talk about kind of social issues and emotional intelligence that allows us to survive. The other point in all this, and this is really the story of left and right hemispheres, we do so by continuously, and that's a key word, activating and deactivating neural networks. In our early studies, when we studied ethics in the brain, what we wanted to see is what parts of the brain activated. And that was pretty fascinating. And we found out that in certain personalities, that the moral reasoning was activated by channels that really emphasize rules. That was more left hemispheric. In another cohort, we found that people had another set of norms with ethics, and that's about care and empathy. And that was more right hemispheric in that. But you have to use both of them. And that's the real key point here, is that we need to develop whole brain thinking and whole brain organizations. And that's a lot more difficult than we think. Just as alums, you'll be interested to know, if you don't know already, I think our claim to fame among others in neuroscience is our objective of trying to create and build brain-friendly environments. And that's the interface of the med school and the business school. You know, how do we create humane environments, you know, low stress but high challenge, that are engaging and allow us to fully participate and use all of our brain power and achieve our potential. And that's what we're really talking about. So let me move on here. And the history of hemispheric analysis and thinking is very, very bumpy and very, very controversial for very, very good reasons. Because the foundation of it was the outcome of a debate about whether the brain was just a kind of gelatinous mass that just worked somehow to create all these different capacities, or was it a series of very discrete components, each one very specialized, that ran at a particular time. And that model culminated at one point in the 19th century with the models suggested by phrenologists, and all of you are familiar with this. This is one of the more charming versions of it. You know, you have all these different components that they think. I love the one in the prefrontal cortex, upper right, human nature. I'm not sure what that is or whether it's a good thing, but apparently they think so because they see this as a picture of good health. There's amativeness, which I assume is basically lust, acquisitiveness, which is greed, all kinds of spirituality. And it's very charming. Of course, it's also very wrong. What they were doing was looking at the 18 bones of the human skull and tracing them and the cartilage between them, the soft tissue or connective tissue, and trying to then infer from that what kind of thinking or emotion or parts of our personality are related to it. And it was pure, you know, joyous speculation, but they took it very seriously. And it sort of gave rise, unfortunately, then to a trend to make these kinds of conclusions drawn. And of course, there was no technology to check anything to speak of. And so they made extravagant claims that were more misleading and sometimes very destructive. And nowhere was that more evident with hemispheres. Here's just a few examples of what happens and when people did the same thing, kind of mapped on these characteristics as though they were inviolable, unchangeable kind of qualities to the left or the right hemisphere. And so what you got were these claims that you can see there. You're either left-brained or right-brained. Obviously not true. You're using both hemispheres interactively all the time. The brain is always working, by the way. Even when you're asleep or in a coma, the default mode network is operating. You see some of that and experience it in dreams. Another claim, was a typical one, is the function of your brain, your personality, you can't change. This is who you are. You're either left-brained, kind of loony, or a literal person, or a right brain creative. That was often a split. And then, of course, this turned into a garden industry and business, and understanding brain dominance can definitely guide your career choices. So all you have to do is have some way of mapping this and know. The fact is that it's a very fluid process all the time. And by the way, in our research, we're not only interested in what's activated, but what's deactivated and why. Because that also tells you so much of the story. At any given moment, the brain can be using 60% of its energy to shut down things so that it can activate others. And of course, all of this is instantaneous and outside of our conscious awareness. So we're making choices all the time. I'll give you a very quick example. If I ask you a question that's done in the moral research area, is it okay to take an American flag to clean a toilet? You know, you're going to have an instantaneous response to that. And then I'm going to start asking you questions. Well, why is it not okay? You know, we're trying to be ecologically minded, and sustainability says we reuse things, and we could have this spirited argument. What's happening is you had, as I did, an instant, intuitive, basically insula-based reaction to this. It's a kind of yucky question anyway. But you have an instant answer. And then if I start pushing you, then we activate the prefrontal cortex. And it's a kind of post hoc rationalization of why that's not okay, or if it is okay. That's how it works. But you're getting multiple activations very, very quickly. And I'll give you an example of that in a minute. Obviously, the opportunity to commercialize on all this stuff. I mean, you've got all these brain exercise programs and things. And, you know, one of your questions might be, do they work? And the answer is, I don't know. I think some of these mental gymnastics and brain building exercises, they're certainly not going to hurt, but it's not clear to me, or probably anybody in neuroscience, whether what they actually do is allow you to perform better on the next test. So it becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Madison Avenue and AdMen picked up on this, though. And here's a good example of how the left-right brain kind of dichotomy was used to establish and describe and build brand preferences. And this is Apple or Mac versus PC. You'll remember these. They're quite charming, actually.
Hello, I'm a Mac.
And I'm a PC.
I'm into doing fun stuff like movies, music, podcasts, stuff like that.
I also do fun stuff like timesheets and spreadsheets and pie charts.
Okay, you know, by fun, I mean more in terms of, for example, it'd be kind of hard to capture a family vacation, say, with a pie chart, you know?
Not true.
Oh?
For example, this light gray area could represent hangout time, whereas this dark gray area could represent just kicking it.
Yeah, no, I feel like I was there.
So you can see where this goes. You can monetize these things, and of course, what happened was actually quite serious. Was that in fact the whole field became discredited as just kind of commercial fluff, and so serious neuroscientists stayed away from it. I think people probably underestimate the extent to which academic research is guided by fads. By popular culture, but it's deeply impacted by it. The reality is that there is, and this is the more, we have copies of this. This isn't something you're going to read right now, but I'll just give you a brief synopsis, and there's a short version of this as well. But basically, we know that brain function is distributive. And by the way, this is true of virtually all species. So this is nothing that's unique to human beings. We do have unique things, of course, about us, mirror neurons that allow us to learn and imitate faster, much more saturated in human beings. But these kinds of things are split, and basically, the idea of analytical, concrete, sequential logic, literalism, a lot of math and science, and information processing. And of course, the control of the right part of the body is in the left hemisphere. Most of our language function is in that. On the right hemisphere, it's quite different. It's much more big picture. It's intuitive. It picks up on the nonverbal, which is basically what allows us to understand so much about relationships. It understands meaning and purpose, things like irony and metaphor. So much of our thinking is metaphorical, and that's the right brain typically that is involved, or the right hemisphere. I should speak more clearly about that. And has a fuller range of emotions, although many of them are negative, which is why people in the creative spheres often suffer from affective or manic depressive kinds of illnesses. It's also better typically at multitasking. And by the way, there's another interesting, among many differences in gender, that the connection between these two hemispheres is much more evolved in women, much stronger typically in all of this. So when you talk about multitasking, you have to look at gender to see, who's trying to do it and how well it can go in that. So those are some of the basic differences. And music, it will typically say musicality is more on the right hemisphere. Again, any of this is partially true. The left hemisphere is also musical, but it's more limited. It's more about identifying rhythm. And again, we'll come back to that, interestingly enough. The point, of course, is that none of us experience this as something that happens in our brain, that somehow some elements of our brain are working and others aren't. We immediately unify these, if we're working in a healthy kind of way, and experience things as a kind of whole unified kind of experience. Let me give you an example of this. And while we might be experiencing this short story that I'm going to share with you from a different perspective, depending on which hemisphere is more active as I read this to you, the whole experience is unified. There is a story told, a true story from what I know, of Hemingway, and I think it's true because it occurs in a bar, so that makes it very believable. What they were drinking, and one of his drinking buddies said, you writers, you have it easy. Of course you write successful stories because you have all the paper in the world and lots of ink, and you can just go on forever. And eventually something good comes up. And he challenged him to write something short. And Hemingway said, that's not true. I can write a story in 3 lines. They challenge him. So he takes a napkin out, takes his pen out, and he writes the following. And this is the shortest of his short stories. For sale, baby shoes, never worn, the end. Now, what happens to you right now is that you're getting an activation in both of your hemispheres. You're engaged in this story, And the typical response probably is, well, what happened to the baby? What's going on here? And, there's an emotional reaction to it as well. This doesn't sound good. This doesn't sound right. And we get totally engaged. And it's a massive kind of brain activation. Interestingly enough, I shared this story because I was having ongoing conversations with one of my students who's severely Asperger. And we would talk about different kinds of pieces of literature or art or music and what it was like for him and how I saw it. And because he wanted to see how other people might experience something. When he heard this, he said, well, let me think about this, because if they haven't been worn, then they're actually, even though they're kind of used, they're actually new. So you should get a very good price for this. Although because it's pre-owned, that might decrease the value some. And you can see where he went, and went into kind of accountancy land, and which made perfect sense for him. in this. By the way, this is the same student who wanted me to give him feedback on if he was making contributions in class that were inappropriate or off the mark. And it was very poignant. He really was trying to work to get back into kind of a human world with everybody else. And he said, so will you give me feedback? And I said, yes. And after one class in particular, he came up and he said, can you give me any feedback about today? Because I had called on him. And I said, no, I thought that you were, right on the mark. It was a good point. And I said, why are you concerned? And he said, well, I'm concerned because you called on me once, but you called on Mark 3 times and Beverly 4 times. And he had everybody's name in his mind in his class and how many times I'd called on them. And I'd only called on him once, just for whatever reason. So processing things in a very different way. But the point here is that these stories engage you and involve you. Nowhere is that more true than in general in the arts and in music in particular. And this is kind of the best way I can give you a synopsis of how all this actually works. All these capacities that are distributed in left and right, lateral and inferior levels of the brain. So this is, there we go. Let me just let you listen to this.
We used to think that there was a music center in the brain. We don't think that anymore. There are music centers and they're spread all over the brain.
The auditory cortex activates as it receives signals from the brainstem through the inferior colliculus and the medial geniculate nucleus.
If you could look at all the different areas of the brain involved in extracting the signal from sound to turn it into music, you'd see a bunch of coordinated and a bunch of uncoordinated firing in different parts of the brain, kind of like a neural symphony, a neural orchestra. So pitch is processed in one set of neural regions, tempo in another, loudness in another, timbre, whether it's a violin or a trumpet or a human voice in yet another, and it all comes together later. The later in this case is maybe 30 thousandths of a second, so rapidly that you never knew the things were ever apart.
Okay, so we have this beautifully integrated, syncopated system in our brains that allow us to experience things, to write symphonies, to hear symphonies, and what happens. And here's where the title of this presentation comes in, and forgive me, I got out of sequence here. This is all meant to be integrated. And what happens when it isn't? And that's where I'm going to go next. But this is a summary that's a little more readable probably of left and right hemisphere. And just a quick review again, that the left hemisphere, again, literal, concrete, sequential, the algorithms, logic, it's more tactical, it's more momentary, has a limited range of emotions, often is processing more anger than any other emotion. Right hemisphere, we think, is much more abstract, symbolic principles. In ethics, the left hemisphere is concerned about rules, the right hemisphere is concerned about more principles, and in that sense, higher level, more intuitive, more strategic. What's tricky here is being able to then understand things in a broader kind of context while understanding at the same time the details. This is a both and kind of thinking. And we spend a lot of time talking about how executives at their best are able to both be tactical and strategic, that these aren't either ors. But what happens in cultures is we tend to promote one style or one set of competencies over the other at the expense of other capacities and lose our potential accordingly. So we know that in organizations, for those of you in the business world, that get too caught up on the tactical operational and lose their strategic focus and meet a very untimely death oftentimes. Other ones who are wild on the strategy piece and doing 100 acquisitions every few years and completely lose their focus in the sense of understanding how to deliver quality goods and services and lose out in the marketplace. So this call for health is the capacity to do both of these. There's an interesting thing, just sticking with the music for a while. One thing is that Mozart's little piano sonatas, by the way, are described as, quote, too simple for children and too complex for adults, meaning that it's too easy in the kind of left hemispheric world to master the actual tune, Ba Ba Black Sheep, for example. And yet, in order to really give that music its emotional meaning and convey that meaning, you have to have a lot of real world experience and the richness of an adult perspective. And it makes it very challenging to take those few simple notes and really convey the potential meaning and impact that Mozart wrote and intended for this. There's a famous French movie called All the Mornings of the World where it's about a cello master, and he's listening to a student who's very good technically and can play the instrument, but doesn't play the music. And that's what the master says. He says, giving feedback to his student, I hear a musician, but I don't hear music. We need the left and right hemisphere. You have to be technically good to be able to deliver. You have to be organized and planful again, but you also have to understand purpose and meaning and why you're doing this and have a sense of a higher purpose, if you will. So this is what Ian McGilchrist wrote about. He's one of my heroes in this, and I'll describe this quote in a minute, but I would commend to your attention, if you ever listen to Shankar Vedantam, Hidden Brain, NPR. It's a wonderful, wonderful series, and I'm actually going to steal one little excerpt from that in a moment. But on February 6, 2019, he interviewed Ian and in a conversation called One Head, Two Brains. And he described this, and interestingly enough, McGilchrist was a classics professor. Is a brilliant mind, a historian. He's got bored, so he went to medical school because he thought that'd be more interesting, and then he became a neuroscientist, and he's a really genuinely a Renaissance man. And part of his book, which is massive, it's called The Master and His Emissary. The master is the right hemisphere. The master plan, the overview, the sense of purpose, all of that tends to be more correlated neurologically with the right hemisphere. The emissary is the one who makes this stuff happen. So, Steve Jobs wants to make a dent in the universe, but he also had the ability to use his training in calligraphy to understand how to build interfaces so that computers can be used by lay people like us and make Apple computers user-friendly again and desirable. So what McGilchrist's concern is that we've become so enraptured with technology and in whatever format and the algorithms that support it, that we've lost a fundamental part of our humanity. And the compromise in the arts is a great example of that. Again, the understanding the why, the right hemisphere is concerned with why and with, again, purpose. The left hemisphere tends to be more concerned, in his view, with the how. And so we become technocrats and technicians. I personally must say, I find this true particularly with Facebook, with Mark Zuckerberg, that he creates this incredible empire, and then he's utterly stunned and I think flummoxed by the fact that it's used in all kinds of ways that he never imagined nor intended, and really has no ability to deal with it in any effective way from what I can see, other than getting a bit arrogant. And yes, he is smart, but this is a major issue. So McGilchrist's book is about a history, really, of civilizations. And the basic theory here has been around for some time, and that is, psychiatrists have talked about that. If you look at personalities, they are relatively stable through human history, we could argue. For example, you can pick up Homer, you can pick up Shakespeare, you can recognize a Falstaff. You can recognize these kind of characters, the buffoon, the flatterer, the fool, the vain king, the vain leader, King Lear, which we should all be reading now again, because it talks about what happens when narcissistic leaders enter into a crisis. So all of these different characters have always been around, which is, again, why in Iceland they have a 1,500-year-old epic story about a particular character And everybody can recognize and relate to it today because, again, the range of available personalities is stable. What changes is who gets selected, who gets promoted, who are the cultural heroes, who are the icons. And that's what McGilchrist is concerned with, that we are promoting certain personalities and certain, if you will, brain capacities, and celebrating them, and they become culturally dominant. And they do so at the expense of other potential capacities and forms of humanity. It's an argument for diversity, among other things. In this case, neurodiversity, frankly. So that's kind of his pitch. And let me see where we are. So, yeah, and this is the slide that summarizes what I just said. I'll just let you glance through this. I kind of put my own references for you. Hervé is my friend Hervé Koiko that I mentioned, who was describing the cultural divides in France, where you have an elite technical, often polytechnic trained class of French intellectuals and business people, and left behind is everybody else. And it's creating huge backlash and sounding like almost the potential for a second French Revolution. And then you create subcultures. And Silicon Valley, of course, is famous for this. You've probably heard this before, but in Silicon Valley, of course, this is largely male. If there is a pathology that one would speculate is probably most represented, it is Asperger's, highly technical people. And the saying among the women, apparently in Silicon Valley, is in the ratio of male to female, is that the odds are good, but the goods are odd. That's how they sort of summarize their social and subcultural lives in this. James McGregor Burns, who was kind of one of the leading theorists in leadership theory, has talked for years about presidential races and saying that we have two candidates typically in the United States, and one who can't think and one who can't feel. And to the extent to which that might be true, that we often have a pretty cerebral, logical, policy-oriented, perhaps even policy-wonkish kind of candidate, and then another one who's fueling emotions and capitalizing on that as a political opportunity. We'll leave it at that. The other place where it actually occurs and is problematic in the current world, as we talk about divided brains and divided world, is economists. And the issue there is, again, missing the big picture of a very technical, quantitative approach to things, which is fine, but not if that's the only thing you have. A number of years ago, the top Nobel Peace Prize went to a guy who did a study on cueing behavior, how we perform and function in lines, okay? And there was a huge backlash, appropriately, from the academic community saying this is much ado about nothing. It is obsessing about trivial algorithmic formulas, and that economists are missing the big picture. And the example at that time that was given was understanding poverty. How can you live in a world with poverty and now currently with increasing levels of inequality, and yet we're talking about GDP numbers and minutia and saying, well, the Dow Jones is doing great. And of course, we're seeing this in political campaigns. Meanwhile, things are literally on fire. So I put this in just because there's a whole series of these in the New York Times of measuring the economy all wrong, and that we're not addressing, again, the issues of broader purpose and meaning, and becoming very clever at running algorithms and congratulating ourselves on low inflation or high GDP or whatever it is. And what GDP doesn't show is the distribution within the GDP. So yeah, you have economic growth, but who's getting it? And of course, the numbers are fascinating in that sense, because if you ask people, do you want to live in a world where the top tier of people, top 5% control 80% of the wealth? Or do you want to live in a world where the top tier of people control 40% of the wealth and the rest is distributed equally through social strata everywhere? and everyone will opt for number two, Republicans, Democrats, both. And yet, and what the numbers are actually based on, and I can get you these if you're interested in, is actually the real numbers right now as they exist comparing the US and Sweden. So across the board, Americans will say they want the Swedish distribution of wealth, and yet, you know, here we are, right, in this world. And these are the conversations we don't have. And that, again, is the problem of measuring and focusing on this. It's called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. We create a map with our metrics and then forget that that's not reality. And it certainly isn't reality for the vast majority of Americans now who are in difficulty. The problem of orthodoxies is simply that academic enterprises have metrics and they become part of a kind of worshipful reality. Artists remind us that our maps are not reality. This is the famous Magritte, this is not a pipe. I don't need to go into that in any more detail. And the charming example of this is if you get lost in left hemispheric world, there's a TV show about it, right? Big Bang Theory. And it's about what happens when you lose some of those capacities that are based in your right hemisphere. And one of the things is irony, paradox, and yes, sarcasm. So I'm just going to play you the audio version of this episode from the Big Bang Theory, okay? Penny comes home from working in the Cheesecake Factory, and you know, she has not found this morally uplifting, professionally gratifying, or particularly spiritually fulfilling. And this is her way of explaining this, which loses Sheldon pretty quickly.
Hey, Penny, how was work?
Great. I hope I'm a waitress at the Cheesecake Factory for my whole life.
Was that sarcasm?
No.
Was that sarcasm?
Yes.
Was that sarcasm?
So there you have it. So it was sarcasm, of course. Here's the example, and I just got this, a fascinating example, and I'll move through in the next 5 minutes and kind of bring this to a close. A friend of mine works with Bell Labs. Bell Labs has, I think, more Nobel laureates and makes Silicon Valley look like a group of lightweights than any other institution in this country. And their history is amazing. If you look at everything they invented from, you know, starting really with silicone chips and the foundation of all computer science. Well, they have a breakthrough right now going on where they can actually solve the problem of internet access around the world very quickly in a very low cost kind of way. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary. And what happened? What happened is they can't get anybody to fund it. So if you can imagine an ideal like this of where we can get kids, and particularly in COVID right now, where we can get access to all internets in all kinds of remote places of the world, irrespective of their economic or geographic locale, if you will, wouldn't that work? And so they called my friend Steve Shepard because they were stuck. And so Steve said, well, I'll help you communicate this so that you can get funding from venture capital firms. But you need to send it to me. So they sent him the document. The document was 500 pages long. So he said, nobody's going to fund this because nobody's going to read this, guys. You can't do that. And they said, yeah, but there's all kinds of good stuff in there. And he said, that doesn't matter. You send me the summary. So they worked, and 2 weeks later, he gets a summary. The summary is 125 pages. Okay. So he said, all right, you know, I'll go along with the game. So they sent him, and I'm just sharing with you, this is their opening gambit. And I'm sorry, this slide got a little messed up. It's got Steve's logo, but here, you can read this if you want with me, but I'll read it quickly. So this is the great idea that you're gonna want to invest in. So hang on to your wallets or your purses. This, as you agree, is a very, very exciting part of this technology. As the vertical and horizontal deployment rates approach the alpha spreading factor of a typical 3-tier society, the uptick rate between tiers manifests itself in a random, growthful pattern that results in positive technology infiltration. So you with me so far here? All right, these people, yeah, probably have an IQ collectively of beyond the ionosphere. Furthermore, the well-known affinity effect kicks in at the 80% acceptance knee curve, at which point the friends and family effect also manifests itself. The technology at this point is considered to be mature and optimally deployed, and when that point is reached, both short and long-term impacts are realized. So you're ready to invest, right? So this is probably the best example I can give you of what happens if you create a document using only your left hemisphere. Now, there's not any way that you can understand. What they are saying, by the way, in this is three things. One, it tells, if you use the right hemisphere, you'd know how it works. And what it is, it's a leapfrog technology. It doesn't use any existing technology. It goes over and beyond everything else that we have and uses a different way of essentially deploying electrons that activate IT systems. So that's why it works. It works because it's so cheap that the economies of scale make it instantly scalable so you can get it everywhere. So it's all those messages that are left out. Let me bring this back to planet Earth a little bit, because here's another example, and then we'll talk about why these divides that Ian McGilchrist is so concerned about should be concerning, that whether it's social media or other ways in which we are now conducting our business, it's really making us at risk for honoring and being able to carry on traditional institutions, including democratic ones. This is a great example we use in our courses of what happens when somebody works in a very logical kind of way, using, again, only part of their brain. And we'll discuss what that is. This is the first debate that Ted Kennedy had as a 30-year-old when he was campaigning for his Senate in the US Senate in Massachusetts. And it was the collision of two titanic families, the Kennedys and the McCormicks. John McCormick was Speaker of the House, of course, as you know. His son was running for this Senate seat. So here's the clash. And what I want you to notice is that when John McCormick is on the attack, and I can say this because I was on Ted Kennedy's staff as a student, that everything John McCormick is saying was factually and logically quite true, I would say. But see what you think.
And when Ted was challenged to a televised debate, the president feared his inexperienced younger brother might give in to his emotions if attacked.
I remember sitting in the Oval Office being peppered by questions by my brother and by a couple of his aides, which was quite intimidating, certainly, to say the least, but I was being asked by the master.
The president had Ted rehearse his responses and warned him to stay calm, no matter what McCormick said.
If his name was Edward Moore, with his qualifications, with your qualifications, Ted, if it was Edward Moore, your candidacy would be a joke. But nobody's laughing. Nobody's laughing. Nobody's laughing because his name is not Edward Moore. It's Edward Moore Kennedy. I say it makes no difference what your name is.
McCormick's attack backfired. Ted Kennedy won the sympathy of the audience and the primary. He would go on to face Republican George Lodge, son of Henry Cabot Lodge, the Boston Brahmin John Kennedy had defeated a decade earlier.
What McCormick left out of the equation, of course, was the emotional element of it. And also, which would have allowed him maybe to understand the nonverbal, because when he was jabbing and attacking Kennedy, it was aggressive, it was hostile, and it immediately turned Teddy into the underdog, and everyone was rooting for him. So when you heard that outburst of emotion, when he said, your candidacy would be a joke, people were furious, and the backlash started. And I actually timed this. This whole episode took about 35 seconds for McCormick to unload on Kennedy that way, and it ended his political career. So the stakes in these things, when we talk about the failure to use kind of emotional reasoning and emotional intelligence, which is very real, can be very, very damaging and costly. So that affected him as an individual. I would argue that we are challenged now culturally, and I'm going to skip this next slide. Let's see if I can. And our task with the business of how do we heal the divide? And the perspective that I took on this was we begin with ourselves. How do we take care of ourselves and then the people that we care about, and the businesses that we run, and the families that we lead and participate in. How do we do this to optimize the chance that we can actually create brain-friendly environments at home and at the office, wherever that is now, and to lead lives where we're really using and living up to our full potential, intellectually, morally, in every other kind of way. And here's some of the research that I think really opens the doors that we want to open. The key in all this thing is we're getting diverse inputs from our own brain, hence the early examples of left and right brain, almost personalities. We know that successful leaders think integratively. They get as much input as they can, and ideally they get conflicting opinions and then work to synthesize those. The highest art in all this that the brain is capable of is synthesis, of taking those diverse inputs from multiple neural networks, and while simultaneously attending to the details and the strategy and the big pictures, and the practicalities and the ethical, moral constraints, and make good decisions that have good precedence. The example of this was Alfred Sloan at General Motors, who used to assign his executives roles where they would come back to disagree, and that they would have real debates, and he would engineer them. I'm going to walk through these quickly. Building social network density, connecting to more people, different kinds of people. If you interview centenarians who are successful and healthy, what they will tell you are the things that they notice and the things that they do that are non-routine. It's fascinating. You know, I try to see something new every day, one of my patients said to me. And they're intrigued by different points of view, different kinds of cultures and individuals. And what we now know is being exposed in a reasonable way to contrarian viewpoints is really a brain builder. How do you reconcile somebody who understands something differently? The problem with the degree of division we have now is it's in an environment of hostility, and that doesn't help and doesn't work. We know that mindfulness and listening and stress management allows us to quiet our active brains and to begin to be more reflective and draw on our different capacities internally as well as externally. Paying attention to how we pay attention, not being distracted, lowering levels of stress, getting rid of noise is actually a very big issue. Interestingly enough, we talk about the stress with COVID. The decline in commuting has actually decreased a lot of stress for people. Monitoring your self-talk, it's very easy to get yourself in a bad place, particularly these days. Exercise, critical. Aerobic strength, and play, and keeping mentally active. And this is very quick, I'm running out of time here, but there's a fascinating team of neuroscientists in Canada, and they're studying the Inuit, Eskimos. And what they have found is that the younger generation, I mean, the Arctic is a very hard place to navigate because there's not a lot of landmarks there, right? So and their survival is based on going out into vast areas of the Arctic for hunting and gathering. And so they got to be able to navigate to find the places and get back. And the sky, the water, the ice, all meld together. And in fact, seal hunters have there's called seal hunter psychosis, that they can become catatonic because it's such a stressful kind of environment because there's no differentiation and they get disoriented. So the younger Inuit use GPS. The older use use the sky, use stars, ice formations, whatever they use, but they navigate, and they do have maps, and they use those as well. Here's the punchline, that the younger Inuit are in their 30s, who've been using the GPS, are already displaying signs of dementia. The older, over 60 crowd of our group here, are remarkably free from dementia. So, you know, break out the charts, the maps. Technology is disabling as well as enabling. And so being very mindful about how you use that, you know, it's just all too easy. I'm not sure the fact that none of us remember phone numbers anymore It's nice in one sense, but we pay a price. In neurology and neuroscience, there's the use it or lose it phenomenon here. So paying attention to that is important. Nutrition, we know anti-inflammatory plant-based diets are brain friendly and help enormously. And the last one, in this crazy world where we can't tell one day from another, as I was saying to my colleagues in this project, every day is Blur's day. So paying attention to sleep. Sleep is when we actually consolidate memories. And Christian Jernstad was the neurologist, neuroscientist at Dartmouth that I knew and worked with some, who really showed that if you really want to capture information and attend to your memory, you pay attention to sleep. And now we also know it's absolutely critical. There's actual parts of our immune system that don't even work when we're awake, that they work only when we're asleep. If you want to read a great study on this, it's called The Beautiful Cure. And it's about our immune systems, which appear to be every bit as complex as our brains. So final thoughts. In our role, we were trying in the medical school to build health. In the business school, better organizations. In both, we use the model of building brain-friendly, using our full capacities, and kind of affecting what one Peace Corps director defined as leadership, which is the ability to build environments where everybody can achieve their potential. And nowhere is that more evident than in the research now on left and right brain functioning, that we need both. We need each other. We need to have respect and courtesy as we honor different people and personalities and capacities that we bring to solving the urgent problems of the day. So this is kind of a dream that we can optimize in this way and be our full and best selves. And I'll close with a classic proverb from Brazil, which is that when we dream alone, it's only a dream, but when we dream together, it's no longer a dream. It's the beginning of a new reality. So hopefully we can together, as we understand ourselves better, achieve that dream. So I'm not leaving much time here, and I apologize, although we may be able to go over a little bit. But Andrea, maybe we'll just unceremoniously quickly shift to any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Gilkey. Wow, I was definitely not smart enough for this presentation, but took lots of notes and learned tons of things and probably missed 100 other things. One of the questions you hit on, which is what is the opportunity for education to help develop a more balanced use of brains? And you told us that the medical school and the business school at Emory are doing this. Is it going on at a broader level, or what about for younger children in primary care?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's done, and Dan Goleman's work is very much a part of that. And another guy, Richard, I'll think of his name, it's a Greek name, but he wrote the book called Resonant Leadership. But there are programs for kids on empathy, and that's a huge brain builder. And really working in schools and preschools, kind of stopping social interactions or even creating them and asking kids, okay, how do you think this makes Susan feel? How do you think this meal makes Ted feel? And really a whole series of educational efforts. And it actually is showing that it's improving kids' math skills, all kinds of collateral benefits from it. So yeah, it's basically called social emotional education.
Fantastic, excellent.
Yeah. And in medical schools, by the way, one of the things they learned in one study is they found out in several studies actually that the most highly technical, and this we might think of as a bit more left hemispheric, physicians or board certified got sued on average 5 times more frequently than general practitioners. And the reason for that was that they said that technical education did nothing to increase empathy, tolerance, or a sense of responsibility in patient care. And when that article came out in JAMA many years ago, Journal of American Medical, it started a revolution in medical schools where patient care and being able to connect and not just being a mechanic and a technician, but being a healer and listening. All kinds of programs came out in medical schools. And by the way, just as an aside, at Grady, students are assigned a disease and are put in the hospital as a patient so they know what it's like. That gives you a lot of empathy. The other thing that they are doing, which is wonderful, Bill Ely's been behind this, is if you're going to be seeing Mrs. Jones, who lives in Southeast Atlanta, for an 8 o'clock appointment on Friday, you have to go to her house and leave her house in time to get to that appointment at 8 o'clock and get to the hospital the way that she gets to the hospital, which may be taking 3 buses and standing out in the rain and the cold. So you understand what it's like even to show up for an 8 o'clock appointment in the Grady Health System. And so there's a lot of stuff that is going on in this area, but those are just some examples.
Fantastic. We are out of time, but I'm going to ask the next question, and certainly if folks need to drop off, they will. But it's a poignant one. Why do you think we are so desensitized to the rifts and the conflicts, you know, in the political world that we're experiencing? And it's not just this election, it's been the last few.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the $64,000 question. And I think your point, and the question's a good one because they've always been there. I mean, that's, if you read about campaigns, political campaigns in the 19th century, you know, they were no holds barred. And there were tremendous risks. And unfortunately, I think the one area that's been consistent with all this is so much of these divides have been around racial issues. And, you know, slavery was, you know, the undoing potentially of everything. And those things persist, and they persist in our brains. We do, when the research is done on people who are not racist in any sense that we would identify, and yet when they see a picture of a person in a brain scanner, fMRI, of an opposite race or different race, their amygdala, which is their alarm system, goes off. So we have built-in brain reactions that are primordial, that don't change in a generation or two, even though our attitudes hopefully change and our behavior changes. But we have a legacy of neural substrates that make it very difficult. And I think the real question is, why is it suddenly become the norm that lack of civility and the kind of aggression and hostility that we saw last night, and the chaos that it generates, why is that now permissible? If you want a fascinating read, I think he was 21 years old at the time. George Washington wrote a book on civility, and it's absolutely extraordinary. And the fact that he, as a founding father of our nation, saw civility as a bedrock in some sense is not accidental, I think. And I think we can deal with these divides within ourselves, but we need to be able to do so in a respectful way. And I think that's part of what's been compromised. And I'm not sure I understand any better than anybody else, but great questions. I apologize because we got squeezed on time. That's my fault.
Well, thank you so much. You have given us so much to absorb, so much to think about. And I have to say, I do think this is my favorite slide, because I think this is the great takeaway that people can have of how do we take care of ourselves. And I hope our audience appreciates that. And I hope we can maybe each try to put at least one of those into play. 5K might be one of them, but lots of opportunities there. As always, Dr. Gilkey, you're just incredibly fascinating. We love your wit, love the variety of the material. We are so grateful that you spent so much time with us and gave us so much information. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm happy to respond to people if they want to reach me through Emory. It's just rgilkey@emory.edu. And I'm happy to follow up or provide resources or do whatever I can to support you and all of our attendees today. So thank you.
Thank you. Everyone take care.
Yeah.